Babylon didn't fall, it was rewired. After Alexander walked into the city, the Anunnaki didn't vanish, they changed masks. Members, from cosmic rulers to coded spirits in stars, spells, and secret books. And if you follow the trail to the end, remembers, you'll see what survived and why it still matters. A clay tablet, smaller than a paperback, cracked at the edges like a dried rivet. Remembers, and pressed into it tiny wedge-shaped marks made by human hand 5,000 years ago are words that feel light, writing, and more like a message smuggled across time. Remembers, because the moment you translate those marks, you realize something unsettling. The oldest cities on Earth did just worship gods. Remembers, they described a system, a cosmic government, a bureaucracy of heaven that could approve kings, assign destinies. Remembers, punish entire populations, and when the noise of humanity became unbearable, vote to erase the world with a flood. And then here's the part that hits like cold water. Those same gods, the Anunnaki, don't disappear when empires fall. Remembers, they change, they migrate, they get rebranded, reinterpreted, swallowed by new languages and new rulers. Remembers, they go from being the architects of reality to being names whispered in private, written into astrological charts. Remembers, invoked as powers in a world that no longer has room for the temples that once fed them. There's that transformation, how a civilization's most sacred powers survive conquest, is the mystery I can't stop thinking about. Remembers, welcome back to Empires Historical. I'm going to be honest with you, when most people hear Anunnaki, remembers, they don't picture dusty temple archives or scribes hunched over clay. They picture internet theories, aliens, secret planets, hidden technology. But the real story is stranger in a quieter way, because it's not about science fiction. Remembers, it's about how humans first tried to organize meaning itself, how they built an entire model of the universe. Remembers, then baked it into politics, law, economics, and identity so deeply that even when their world collapsed, remembers, the ideas kept walking. And if you stay with me until the end of this series, remembers, you will see the Anunnaki do something that feels almost impossible. They'll survive the end of Mesopotamia, survive the Greeks. Remembers, survive the Romans, survive the rise of monotheism, not as an intact religion, but as fragments embedded in other civilizations' thinking. Remembers, like a ghost that keeps changing outfits. But to understand how they transform, we need to start where they first appear. Remembers, not in a Hollywood scene, not in a conspiracy thread on clay, in the heat and mud of southern Mesopotamia. Remembers, around 3200 BC, when Sumerian scribes began committing theology to tablets as if they were writing the operating system of reality. Remembers, here's the core idea, the one that keeps pulling me back. Remembers, the Anunnaki are not introduced as characters the way later mythologies give you, dramatic gods with personal soap operas. In the earliest strands, they feel structural. Remembers, they are described as forces governing the cosmic order between heaven and earth, less like a pantheon of individual personalities, and more like an assembly that makes the universe behave. Remembers, even their name hints at that. Anunnaki grows out of a Nuna offspring or lineage of the sky god. Remembers, later rendered as Anu, but the construction also carries the sense of an authority that spans realms. It's the highest heavens down into the land where humans live and bleed and build. That's the early Mesopotamian obsession. Remembers, the boundary between the unreachable cosmic heights and the tangible world of human experience, and the belief that something. Remember, someone had to manage that boundary. When I picture it, I don't see lightning bolts and mythic monsters first. Remember, I see paper, I see lists, I see offerings recorded in temple inventories. Remembers, because some of the earliest references to the Anuna appear in administrative documents, inventory lists, the Vention offerings dedicated to the Anuna who judge, and the greater Anuna of heaven and earth. Remembers, that detail matters, it suggests something profound. By around 3000 BC, the concept of a collective divine assembly was already present in daily religious practice, not as a poetic metaphor. Remembers, but as an institutional reality. A city didn't only believe in gods, a city managed relationships with gods. Remembers, it fed them, clothed them, housed them, tracked obligations to them, and in return, remembers, the gods through their assembly sanctioned the legitimacy of power on earth. If that sounds political, it's because it was. Remembers, and the most chilling evidence of this divine political framework shows up in a text that reads like propaganda and cosmology at the same time. Remembers, the Sumerian king list. It begins with a declaration that's almost like a constitutional law. Kingship descended from heaven. Remembers, not metaphorically, literally, authority in this worldview is not invented by humans. It arrives already stamped with divine approval. Remembers, then the list does something that makes modern readers blink. It describes pre-flood rulers whose last tens of thousands of years. Elim of Eridu ruling 28,800 years and Menluan of Bad-Tibur ruling 43,200 years. Remembers, those numbers are so impossible that you can treat them as myth, and you should, but they aren't random. Remembers, they reflect an understanding of cosmic timescales, a way of saying, in the beginning, kingship was closer to divine. Remembers, operating under direct supervision of the heavenly assembly. And now we land at Eridu, the city that tradition calls the first city. Remembers, archaeology gives that tradition a kind of haunting weight. Excavations reveal 17 successive temple levels, reaching back toward 5000 BC, 17 rebuilds of sacred space layer on layer, each one a physical statement. Remembers, we are here, the gods are here, and the world continues because the relationship holds. Remembers, what strikes me is that even the architecture feels like theology, temple orientation toward cardinal directions. Remembers, elevated platforms, a sense of building upward as if you were trying to align the city with a cosmic map. Remembers, later Mesopotamian ziggurats will make this explicit, massive step towers functioning as symbolic cosmic mountains where heaven and earth intersect. Remembers, but you can already see the seed of that idea in these early sacred platforms. The notion that the divine order is not abstract. Remembers, it is built into space, and in the myths associated with Eridu, the Anunnaki aren't passive, they don't just watch. They participate in world formation. Remembers, the Eridu Genesis, preserved in later copies but reflecting older Sumerian traditions, describes how the gods established the first cities and appointed kings to govern humanity. After humans are created, the great gods hold assembly and assign destinies. Remembers, that phrase hold assembly keeps coming back like a drumbeat in Mesopotamian literature. Remembers, because it tells you this is not a cosmos ruled by the mood of a single god, it is a cosmos run by deliberation. Remembers, by protocols, by a kind of divine legislature, and once you know to look for it, you see this assembly everywhere. Remembers, Nippur, the city housing one of Mesopotamia's most important religious sanctuaries. Remembers, preserves traditions that illuminate how even supreme deities operate within a broader framework. Remembers, inscriptions describe rulers restoring Enlil's temple for the Anunnaki who decree fate. That line is like a crack in the door. Even Enlil's Stormlord political legitimizer moves inside a larger architecture of authority. Remembers, texts from Nippur describe councils taking place in a cosmic chamber often named as a kind of divine meeting hall where the Anunnaki deliberate on matters affecting gods and mortals. And what's eerie is how formal it feels. 50 greater Anunnaki plus 7 who decree fate, numbers that sound symbolic. Remembers, sure, but also consistent, like an institutional structure with defined roles. It's not just gods, it's categories. Remembers, and that's where another critical distinction emerges. The Anunnaki aren't the only divine beings in Mesopotamian thought. When there are the Ajiji, often associated with watching, with celestial observation, with astronomical phenomena. Remembers, the Anunnaki govern fundamental cosmic principles while the Ajiji are more specialized and, crucially, remembers, subordinate in matters of ultimate authority. Remembers, then there's the group of 7 who decree fate, an executive council inside the larger assembly, tied to the power of decision and destiny. Remembers, the number 7 isn't accidental in Mesopotamian cosmology. 7 visible planetary bodies, 7 days structure and time. Remembers, it's as if the structure of the sky becomes a structure of governance. Remembers, now pause and feel what this worldview does to a human being living inside it. If the universe is run by a council. Remembers, then your life is not simply random, your city is not simply a human invention, your king is not simply a strong man with soldiers. Remembers, everything is nested inside approval systems, mandates, decrees, destinies, and the temple is not merely a place of worship. Remembers, it becomes an interface between cosmic authority and human survival. That's why Mesopotamian religion can be separated from economics. Remembers, temple administrative records reveal massive estates, livestock herds, workshops, trade networks, all feeding the divine presence. One archive records thousands of animals sacrificed over a year. Remembers, it's hard to wrap your head around that scale without seeing what it implies. Keeping cosmic favor required real resources. Remembers, religion was not cheap, it was infrastructure, and the gods weren't imagined as distant abstractions. Iconography shows them wearing horned crowns, more horns, higher rank, dressed in textiles associated with royalty. Remembers, they carry the bearing of rulers because they are rulers, and if you re a human king, your legitimacy depends on positioning yourself as the earthly extension of their authority. That connection becomes explicit in legal ideology. Early law codes begin by saying the king received authority from an Enlil. Remembers, justice isn't merely human preference, it's divine mandate. You can see the shape of a civilization forming. There was cosmic order, political legitimacy, legal structure, economic system, social hierarchy, all braided together. At the center of this braid, Babylonian theologians later identify a triad of great gods, Anu, Enlil. Remembers, Enki, the 3 aren't just top gods, they represent a complementary structure of authority. Anu, Skyfather, sits at the apex. Remote, delegating power more than intervening daily. You will find him described as dwelling in the highest heaven. removed from routine administration, but functioning as final arbiter in disputes among gods, even in creation epics. Remembers, Anu's power can be transferred like a cosmic instrument handed over in a crisis. Enlil governs atmosphere and terrestrial authority storms. Remembers, floods, droughts, but also political legitimacy. His sanctuary becomes a place kings must visit to renew legitimacy. Remembers, if your reign is a contract, Enlil is the one who stamps it. Enki, fresh water, wisdom, craft, medicine feels different. Remembers, he's the patron of humans in a way that can become morally complicated in the narratives. Remembers, he's the one who keeps seeing humanity not as noise or labor, but as lives worth preserving. Remembers, and that moral tension between cosmic order enforced through control and cosmic order preserved through compassion becomes one of the most powerful engines in Mesopotamian storytelling. As now we arrive at the part that, to me, is both brutal and deeply revealing, the creation of humans. Remembers, the Atrahasis epic presents human origin not as a romantic gift, but as a solution to a labor crisis. Remember, the Ajiji lesser gods responsible for maintaining divine estates grow exhausted after decades of toil. Remembers, digging canals, building temples, doing the work that sustains the gods' civilization on Earth, they rebel. Remember, they threaten the stability of cosmic order, so the assembly meets. Remembers, and the solution proposed with a chilling practicality is to manufacture a new category of beings designed for labor. Remembers, humans, the creation itself is theologically sharp, clay mixed with the blood of a slain god who possesses intelligence. Remembers, divine essence provides mind, clay provides flesh, 14 birth goddesses each produce a male and female, establishing both diversity and reproduction. The process takes 10 months, mirroring gestation, as if to say, this is not just magic, it is an ordered procedure, a designed mechanism. Remembers, and the result is a being intelligent enough to understand commands, but not powerful enough to overthrow authority. Remembers, that detail intelligent but subordinate is not an accident. It reveals what Mesopotamian elites feared needed at the same time. Remembers, workers who can build civilization but who want to challenge the cosmic hierarchy. But here's where Enki complicates the machine. Remembers, in some tellings he gives humans a little more than authorized an extra edge of divine essence. Remembers, a gift of intelligence that will eventually lead to independence. And once you see that, the entire myth becomes a meditation on unintended consequences. Wisdom creates capability, capability creates autonomy. Remembers, autonomy creates noise, and noise creates conflict with the system that demanded labor in the first place. Remember, that conflict culminates in the most catastrophic decision the Anunnaki assembly makes, the flood. Remembers, not as a random disaster but as a governance choice. Remembers, the Atrahasis narrative describes human population growth and cultural development producing constant clamor. The land bellows like a bull, the gods grow restless, and Enlil, responsible for maintaining terrestrial order, sees something deeper than noise, humans becoming independent, developing institutions, operating with minimal reference to divine authority. Remembers, it's almost like watching a child grow up and realizing you can control them the way you used to, except in this story. Remembers, the parent has absolute power, so Enlil tries population control, plague, famine, manipulation of weather. But Enki keeps intervening, offering survival strategies, knowledge, ways to endure. Each intervention is not just compassion. Remembers, it's political defiance inside the divine hierarchy. Eventually the assembly votes for total destruction through flood. Remembers, and the story becomes almost legalistic again. The gods swear an oath of secrecy, no direct warning. But Enki finds Alufal speaking to a reed wall rather than to a man. Remembers, indirect communication that technically obeys the oath while violating its spirit. The arc is described with specific dimensions. A perfect cube, 120 cubits in length, width, and height, cosmic completeness rendered as engineering. Remembers, the flood lasts 7 days aligned with the cosmic week. The gods themselves are frightened by the intensity of what they unleash. Remembers, and afterward, when Atrahasis offers sacrifice, the gods gather around it with a hunger that exposes the economics underneath the theology. Remembers, they miss the offerings, they miss the service. That moment always lands hard with me, because it tells you the relationship is not one way. Remembers, humans depend on gods for survival, gods depend on humans for worship and sustenance. Remembers, it's a system of mutual obligation, except one side holds the power to wipe the other out. The post-flood covenant becomes a compromise. Remembers, the gods impose limits. Disease, infant mortality, institutions like celibate priesthood, and divine communication shifts into channels. Remember, dreams, divination, prophetic signs, less direct intervention, more mediated authority. And from this point on, remembers, the Mesopotamian world doesn't just have religion. It has a model of governance where gods become patron rulers of city-states. Remember, temples become administrative centers and cosmic order becomes the template for urban life. Remembers, now here's why all of this matters for what's coming. Remembers, because if the Anunnaki are woven into the very structure of how cities run, how kings justify rule. Remembers, how laws ground our economy is organized, then conquering Mesopotamia doesn't just mean defeating armies. It means colliding with an entire cosmic bureaucracy. Empires will arrive with new languages, new administrative systems. Remembers, new philosophies. The temples will face rivals. The public rituals that once held whole cities together will shrink. Remembers, in the Anunnaki, these once fundamental forces of reality will be forced to adapt. Some will rise in new forms. Remember, some will be reinterpreted through foreign gods. Some will retreat into private practice. Some will survive as names in the sky. Remembers, in the turning point, the moment the old world begins to tilt comes in 331 BC, when Alexander the Great enters Babylon. Remembers, that's where we're heading next. But before we go there, if you want more stories like this where empires aren't just battles and borders, but living ideas fighting to survive, subscribe to Empire's Historical. It genuinely helps the channel keep going. Remembers, and it tells me you want the next chapter, because once the Greeks arrive, the Anunnaki die, they mutate. And what they become is going to surprise you. Remember, and once you accept that the Anunnaki weren't just characters in myths, remembers, but a system, almost a living blueprint for how reality and power were supposed to work, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Remembers, how did that system actually run? I keep coming back to a strange image, one that feels more modern than it should. Picture a city where the temple isn't just a place you visit for comfort or ceremony, but the place where decisions are made. Remembers, supplies are counted, labor is assigned, contracts are witnessed, and kings learn whether they are still approved by the forces above them. Remembers, when I first started tracing the Anunnaki through the old stories, I expected drama, monsters, floods. Remember, divine tempers. What I didn't expect was administration, procedure, hierarchy. Remembers, the sense that the universe itself was being managed like a state. That's where the Anunnaki get unsettling. Remembers, in a quiet way, because if you read them the way Mesopotamians lived them, they were not merely gods in the sky. Remembers, they were a governing class, a cosmic bureaucracy that makes heaven and earth legible. And the more you look, the more you realize. The people of Sumer and Akkad weren't just worshipping the divine, they were negotiating with it. Remembers, feeding it, working under it, and modeling their entire political reality after it. So let's step into the machinery. Remember, start with the architecture, because it tells you the psychology before any text does. Ziggurats weren't to be pretty. Remembers, they were built to be statements. A ziggurat says, the border between the human and the divine is not abstract. Remembers, it is a climate, is elevation, it is controlled access. The very shape, ascending levels, teaches you what the world is. Remembers, not flat, not equal, not random, layered. When you stand in the shadow of a step tower in your imagination, remember, Nipper, what hits you is the scale of devotion it required. Fired brick instead of sun-dried mud brick. Remembers, careful alignments, foundations built to resist water and time. This wasn't casual belief. This was belief hardened into city planning. Remembers, and then you realize what that implies. If a society spends that much labor and wealth to build a mountain out brick, remembers, they were not doing it for decoration. They were doing it because the entire city's relationship with reality depends on it. Remembers, the ziggurat is a physical argument. The gods are above, and we must build our way toward them. But here's the twist that keeps me hooked. Remembers, the Anunnaki weren't worshipped as chaotic forces you begged to spare you. They were worshipped as authorities who oversee order. Remembers, that means ritual isn't just pleading. It's maintenance. You not just praying, you keeping the cosmic machine running. Remembers, that's why the temple economy mattered so much. It's easy to read offerings and imagine a little bowl of grain. Remembers, a few drops of beer, a lamb on a small altar. But the records, those cold, meticulous administrative tablets, tell a different story. Remembers, they describe a steady, organized flow of resources, animals delivered, grain measured, textiles distributed, labor accounted for, in places like the Dreham Archive. Remembers, you can practically feel the scale, thousands of animals moving through temple systems across a year. That isn't symbolic, that's infrastructure. Remembers, and the moment you call it what it is, an economy, you start seeing the Anunnaki not just as spiritual beings but as the top of a supply chain. Remembers, humans worked temple fields, humans managed workshops, humans transported goods, humans sang hymns. Remembers, humans kept the lamps lit and the incense burning because the divine presence wasn't treated like a metaphor. Remembers, it was treated like a resident. The cult statue wasn't representing the god in a modern, poetic sense. Remembers, it was the god's presence made stable. They washed it, clothed it, presented meals, performed music for it. Remembers, it's intimate in a way that feels almost eerie. They treated the divine like a living sovereign who had moved into town. Remembers, and the city's job was to serve. Now, if you were like me, you might ask the uncomfortable question. Remembers, why would gods need food? Why would cosmic rulers require animals, beer, incense, linens? And that question opens a door. Because in Mesopotamia, the relationship between divine and human wasn't one-directional. Yes, the gods granted kingship. Remembers, fertility, protection, law. But humans gave something back: labor, ritual, attention, service. The system was reciprocal, but not equal, like a patron and client relationship scaled up into theology. And this is where the Anunnaki feel less like fantasy and more like political philosophy. In so many texts, this authority is justified by proximity to the divine. Remembers, law codes begin by announcing that the king's authority comes from the gods, especially from the great powers at the top. Remembers, when a ruler builds a temple, restores a sanctuary, funds offerings, it isn't charity, it's legitimacy. Remembers, it's the public proof that the king is still aligned with the Anunnaki's order. Remembers, what really struck me is how often Mesopotamian religion sounds like governance, and Mesopotamian governance sounds like religion. Remembers, the boundary blurs until it almost disappears, and the Anunnaki are the reason, because they weren't one god. Remembers, they weren't even a small family. They were an assembly, a council, a governing body that could deliberate. Remembers, decree, punish, and most importantly decide fate. That phrase decrete sounds mystical until you realize what it functioned like. The right to define outcomes. The right to decide what becomes normal and what becomes impossible. Remembers, in human politics, that's the ultimate power, setting the rules of reality for everyone else. Remembers, the Anunnaki were imagined as possessing that power at a cosmic level, and here the internal structure matters. Remembers, Mesopotamian texts draw lines between divine categories. The Anunnaki are not the only beings. Remembers, there are other groups with specialized roles like the Ajiji, often associated with watching, observing. Remember, celestial functions. That distinction is fascinating because it suggests the pantheon wasn't a chaotic pile of gods. Remember, was organized labor, different divine classes, different responsibilities, different ranks. Remembers, and then there's the number 7, those 7 who decree fate, a kind of executive council inside the larger assembly. Remembers, 7 isn't random. 7 is the visible planets, the rhythm of the week, the organizing pattern of time itself. Remembers, when a culture maps the heavens and sees 7 wandering lights and then builds the concept of fate around 7 divine decreers. Remembers, you can feel the mental architecture clicking into place. The sky isn't scenery, it's the control panel. This is why astronomy mattered, not as hobby, as theology, when Mesopotamian scholars tracked the heavens. Remembers, they weren't just calculating, they were reading. The sky was a text, a place where divine decisions left traces. Remembers, but before we get too far into stars, we have to talk about the triad, because if the Anunnaki are a government, remembers, the triad is the executive branch. Anu and Enki, when you hear their names together, remembers, you're hearing the skeleton of Mesopotamian cosmic authority. Anu is the sky father, but what's intriguing is how he's portrayed. Remote, not absent, but removed, a final arbiter who delegates. That's not the portrait of an impulsive mythic warrior. Remembers, that's the portrait of a sovereign whose power is institutional, not muscular, and I can help noticing how modern that sounds. It's the highest authority doesn't always appear. It legitimizes others, transfers power, ratifies decisions. Remember, that's not weakness, that's design. Then in Lil Storm Wind, the command of lands feels like the hands-on administrator. He's the one whose name shows up in the logic of kingship. Remembers, the one whose sanctuary at Nippur becomes the place rulers travel to receive recognition. Remembers, you can almost picture it as a capital of legitimacy, a spiritual parliament where power gets stamped as lawful. Remembers, an inky freshwater wisdom craft, knowledge feels like the technologist, the patron of civilization's inner workings. Remembers, irrigation systems, skills, medicine, the kind of intelligence that makes cities possible. If Anu is the ceiling, remembers, and Enlil is the law, Enki is the engine. I'll be honest, Enki is the one who complicates the whole moral landscape for me. Because in so many myths, he's the god who bends rules, who finds loopholes. Remembers, who protects humanity when the assembly's decisions become too severe. He's not just clever, he's ethically restless. Remembers, he makes you wonder whether divine authority in Mesopotamia included internal dissent the way human governments do. Remembers, and that's important because the Mesopotamian divine assembly isn't portrayed as a tyrant acting alone. Remembers, it's portrayed as a body that argues, debates, decides, and enforces. You see it in epic literature. Remembers, you see it in stories where God's present cases, witnesses speak, verdicts are issued. The whole thing mirrors legal institutions. Remembers, that parallel is not accidental, it's the culture telling you this is what legitimate decision-making looks like. Remembers, even the gods must deliberate. Now I want to slow down here. Remembers, because this is one of those moments where the Anunnaki stop being myth and start being a worldview that could shape actual behavior. Remembers, if you believe the universe is governed by a council, you build councils. If you believe fate is decreed through procedure, remembers, you value procedure. If you believe kingship descends from heaven, you interpret politics as a sacred trust. Remembers, not a personal achievement, and once you accept that frame, rebellion isn't just illegal, it's cosmic disorder. Remembers, that's why the temple mattered as an administrative center. It didn't just store offerings, it stored legitimacy. It stored contracts, it stored records, it stored the idea that the city was aligned with the cosmic order. Remembers, temples functioned as courts, two places where disputes could be adjudicated with divine authority behind human judgment. Imagine what that does to social stability. A contract isn't just an agreement between two merchants. Remembers, it's witnessed by a cosmic moral system. Breaking it isn't just cheating, it's inviting disorder, maybe even divine punishment, disease. Remembers, poverty, disgrace. The law becomes spiritualized and spirituality becomes institutionalized. Remembers, and then there are the festivals, especially Akitu, which, in my mind, operate like a yearly reboot of the entire system. Remember, Akitu isn't just celebration, it's renewal, it's the city reenacting the original moment of divine appointment. Remembers, reaffirming that kingship is still valid, that the cosmic order still holds. Remembers that the gods are still present and the humans are still serving. One ritual detail always grips me. The humiliation of the king, his insignia removed, his authority symbolically suspended. That's not a weakness in kingship. Remembers, it's a demonstration that the king is not the ultimate source of power. He's a vessel, a servant with a crown. Remembers, not a god. That kind of ritual is political genius. It tells the public. Even the king kneels, it tells the king. Remembers, you rule only by permission, and it tells the priests, you are the gatekeepers of legitimacy because you mediate divine approval. Remembers, if you think this sounds like power dynamics, you rewrite. It's power dynamics written into theology. Remembers, and the iconography reinforces it. Horned crowns, multiple horn pairs indicating rank, an entire visual language of hierarchy. Elaborate garments, dignified postures. Even in art, the Anunnaki are not wild spirits, they are rulers. Remembers, they look like the cosmic version of a royal court. That's why I keep calling it a system, because it's coherent cross-architecture. Remembers, economy, law, ritual, and story. But here's the emotional core for me, what makes this more than a historical puzzle. Remembers, I find myself thinking about what it must have felt like to live inside this world. Remembers, to wake up in a city where the gods are not distant ideals but administrative realities, where a flood, a drought, a storm is not weather but communication, where prosperity isn't only skill but favor. Remembers, where moral behavior isn't only virtue but cosmic maintenance. That kind of world creates a particular kind of human being. Remembers, a person who constantly senses that life is watched, measured, judged not by human opinion alone but by the structure of reality itself. Remembers, and then you realize why knowledge mattered so much. Scribes weren't just writers, they were keepers of the system. Remembers, priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were managers of divine human relations. Astronomers weren't just scientists. Remembers, they were interpreters of the cosmic ledger. Even the division of labor inside the priesthood tells you this. What casual belief. Remembers, you have ranks that supervise operations, specialists in purification, specialists in music, specialists in exorcism. Remembers, specialists who know the liturgy and the accounting. You have long training, memorization, mathematics. Remembers, observation. The temple school isn't just religious education, it's a pipeline for running the city. Remembers, and women often overlooked in popular retellings could hold significant authority in these systems. Remembers, particularly in cults of major goddesses, there are priestesses with high status, ritual roles of enormous importance. Remembers, and in some contexts, economic power through estate management and lending. Remembers, that matters because it shows the temple economy wasn't a simplistic patriarchy of men do everything. Remembers, it was a complex institution that could elevate certain women into positions of immense influence, especially where the goddess cult required it. Remembers, now I can't help but comment on the psychological brilliance of how the system ties personal life to cosmic story. The sacred marriage ritual, for example, isn't just mythology performed on stage, it's an engine of cohesion. It binds the king to the city's goddess, transforms political authority into sacred drama. Remembers, and turns the population into participants in a shared cosmic narrative. When harvests succeed and armies return victorious. Remembers, it confirms the story. The ritual worked, the goddess is pleased, the city is aligned. When disaster hits. Remembers, it confirms the story in another way. Something broke, someone failed, someone neglected the temple. Remembers, someone offended the order. The system makes history interpretable, it makes suffering legible, it turns chaos into moral logic. Remembers that is incredibly powerful, maybe even comforting, but also if you think about it controlling. Because once you believe order depends on proper ritual and obedience, dissent becomes not just risky, remembers, but spiritually dangerous. The Anunnaki don't just rule the skies, they rule the imagination of what is possible. Remembers what is safe, what is allowed. And yet, what keeps me from reducing this to cynicism is the sheer sincerity of the intellectual achievement. They weren't stupid, they weren't merely superstitious. Remembers, they were building the first urban civilizational worldview at a scale no one had done before. They were asking massive questions. Where does authority come from? Why does order collapse? What is fate? Why do societies depend on labor? Why does the sky move with such precision? Why do humans suffer? Remembers, and they answered those questions with a structure that could support city life for millennia. Remembers, so when we talk about the Anunnaki as administrative deities, it's not an insult. Remembers, it's a recognition that Mesopotamia did something astonishing. It connected cosmic meaning to practical governance. Remembers, it made religion functional, not merely emotional, and that function is exactly why the system could evolve. Remembers, because once you have a divine bureaucracy, you can reorganize it, you can elevate one god, redistribute roles. Remembers, absorb foreign deities, reinterpret powers without breaking the basic framework. The system is resilient. Remembers, that's why later periods can take the same structure and adapt it, why Babylon can elevate Marduk, why Assyria can elevate Ashur. Remembers why later scholars can translate gods into stars and rituals into private magic. The Anunnaki aren't a single story. Remembers, they re-platform, and as I sit with that, I feel a kind of awe and unease at the same time. Remembers, or because I'm watching the first great urban minds trying to map power, nature, morality, and destiny into one coherent worldview. Remembers, unease because the same coherence that makes a civilization stable can also make it hard to breathe inside it. Remembers, which brings me to the last thought I want to leave hanging here, because it's the thread that pulls us into what comes next. If the Anunnaki system is this institutional, this embedded in temples, laws, rituals, remembers, and the daily running of a city, then what happens when the city's political center shifts? Or what happens when a foreign empire builds new civic spaces that compete with temples? What happens when Greek bureaucrats, remembers, philosophers and administrators bring a different way of thinking about gods, law and authority? Because a system like this doesn't simply disappear, it adapts, it mutates, it learns how to survive in new forms. Remembers, and that's exactly where our story is headed, into the moment when the old cosmic administrators begin to change masks. Remembers, and the divine government of Mesopotamia starts living on in ways most people would never think to look for. Remembers, and once you see how deeply the Anunnaki system was welded into the everyday machinery of Mesopotamian life, remembers, the shock isn't that it changed under foreign rule, it's that it survived at all. I want you to picture Babylon in 31 BC. Remembers, not as a dusty postcard from antiquity, but as a living, breathing capital that believes its gods are not abstract. Remembers, they are present, they are fed, they are consulted. They are, in a very literal sense, in charge. Then, one day a foreign army arrives, Macedonian banners, unfamiliar accents, a new kind of confidence. Remembers, and at the center of it all stands Alexander the Great. Here's what's eerie. At first, he doesn't look like a destroyer of religion. When he plays the role of a respectful guest, he participates in local ceremonies, acknowledges the temples, orders restorations. It creates this impression, almost like a mirage, that nothing essential is going to change. Remembers, but the deeper I sit with this moment, the more it feels like the opening scene in a slow-motion transformation. Remembers, because power doesn't always break a culture by attacking it head-on. Remember, sometimes it dissolves it by replacing the structures that make it necessary. Alexander dies in Babylon 8 years later, and the symbolism is heavy, almost too perfect. The conqueror who seemed to honor Babylon's sacred world dies in the city's royal space. Remembers, and with him ends the illusion that Mesopotamia will remain the primary author of its own sacred order. Remembers, after that, the world that sustained an Anunnaki worship, temple-centered governance, locally rooted kingship. Remembers, the old circuits of legitimacy starts living under someone else's logic, and that logic had a name. Remembers, Hellenistic administration, when the Seleucid dynasty spreads Greek bureaucratic systems across their empire. Remembers, it introduces something that sounds boring on paper but is devastating in practice, a different way of organizing reality. But the old Mesopotamian model wasn't simply religious, it was civic, economic, legal, and spiritual all at once. Remembers, the temple was the heart and everything else was attached to it like veins. But the Hellenistic model builds parallel institutions, secular civic spaces, new legal habits, new educational ideals. Remembers, new ideas of what knowledge is supposed to be. And knowledge, more than armies, is what begins to change how gods are understood. Members, Greek administrators and intellectuals didn't necessarily come in screaming, "Your gods are fake." That's not how cultural replacement usually works. They came in with habits of classification, remembers, of rational inquiry, of philosophical discussion that treated religious phenomena as objects to analyze rather than powers to serve. Remembers, even when they respected local tradition, they framed it differently, and framing is everything. Once a divine system becomes something you can study instead of something you must obey, its social power starts to shift. Remembers, not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a river changing a landscape one layer at a time. Remembers, the founding of Seleucia on the Tigris, this is one of those details that, the more I think about it, remembers, the more it feels like a turning point disguised as city planning. Seleucia wasn't just a new town. Remembers, it was a new center of gravity, a Greek administrative capital placed alongside, not inside, the old Mesopotamian sacred cities. Remembers, that alongside matters, it creates parallel authority, it says. Remembers, power no longer needs to be validated through the temple because power can now validate itself through an empire. Remember, the new city brought new magnets for ambition, theaters, gymnasia, Rigora spaces designed to create community and identity without needing priests. These places did what temples used to do socially. Remembers, they gathered people, staged collective emotion, offered belonging, provided a sense of being part of something. Remembers, and that's one of the most painful truths about cultural transition. People don't always abandon old traditions because they hate them. Remembers, sometimes they drift because new institutions offer the same human need, status, connection, advancement more efficiently. Remembers, so what happens to Anunnaki worship in a world where young, ambitious Mesopotamians can climb the ladder through Hellenistic structures rather than temple networks? It doesn't vanish, it changes shape. Remembers, and the shape shift is where I find the story truly fascinating because it becomes less about temples and more about translation. Remembers, not just translation of language, but translation of meaning. Enteroboros. Remembers, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the early 3rd century BC, I can't help but imagine the tension inside him. It's because to write Babylon's sacred world for Greek readers, he has to do something dangerous. Remembers, he has to make the Anunnaki legible inside a foreign intellectual frame without letting them dissolve into myth. His multi-volume work Babyloniaca was essentially a bridge built out of words. Remembers, he translated cuneiform narratives into Greek literary forms while trying to keep the theological backbone intact. Remembers, and what's striking is how naturally some elements resonated with Greek audiences. The idea of divine beings descending from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization, culture, heroes guiding mankind. Remembers, benefactor gods shaping order, those are themes the Greeks recognize. That resonance is a gift and a threat at the same time. Remembers, because the moment you find correspondences, you start mapping one pantheon onto another, and mapping always involves distortion. Remembers, you highlight similarities, you downplay differences, you simplify what was once complex. Marduk becomes Zeus. That makes sense if you're relooking at Supreme King of the Pantheon, storm imagery, royal authority. Easy, but here's the problem: when you emphasize Marduk as Zeus, remembers, you risk flattening the rich web of Mesopotamian theology, his relationships to the wider divine assembly. Remembers, the political logic embedded in his rise, the specific Babylonian ritual context that made him more than just a chief god. In other words, syncretism preserves names and status while subtly rewriting meaning. The same happens with Napo and Apollo. Remembers, again, the parallels are real: writing prophecy, intellectual life, artistic inspiration. Remembers, Apollo's connection to Delphi provides a familiar frame for understanding divination. Remembers, and suddenly the Babylonian god of scribal power becomes easier for Greek-educated Mesopotamians to invoke without feeling like they're stepping outside the new cultural world they're navigating. And I love this detail from the texts of the period. Remembers, the possibility of invoking Apollo Nabu in contexts where you need both Greek sophistication and Mesopotamian authority. Remembers, that isn't just theology, it's identity management. It's people living in two worlds at once, trying not to lose either. Remembers, but the story does stop at polite translation and deity equivalences. It gets weirder. Remember, because multicultural Hellenistic cities become laboratories of religious innovation, ideas don't just meet. They combine, react, mutate. Dura Europos is one of the most vivid archaeological examples of that creativity. Remembers, founded around 300 BC, it sits on the Euphrates like a crossroads where cultures collide, and what the remains suggest is astonishing. Remembers, temple complexes where multiple traditions share architectural space. Mesopotamian religious art alongside Greek-style sculptures and inscriptions, ritual deposits that include Egyptian. Remembers, Persian, Arabian influences. It's not a clean fusion, it's a college, sometimes elegant, sometimes chaotic. Remembers, always revealing how humans adapt the sacred when their social world becomes mixed, and under that surface creativity. Remember, something deeper is happening, ritual is changing. Traditional Mesopotamian festivals used to involve entire urban populations in public demonstrations of divine authority. Remembers, processions, ceremonies, communal rituals that made the gods feel like rulers of the city, not private comforts. But in Hellenistic contexts, those massive civic rituals begin to narrow, they become more specialized, as more intimate, more tied to families who maintain ancestral traditions, instead of defining the city's cosmic governance. Remembers, they start functioning as identity preservation. That's an enormous shift. Remembers, it's the difference between a religion that governs public reality and a religion that protects private heritage. Remembers, and here is where I feel the emotional weight of the transformation. Remembers, because you can almost sense what it must have felt like for temple families, priestly lines, and old scholarly communities. Remembers, watching the city center of gravity move elsewhere, watching the young get educated in new institutions. Watching the loud public festivals shrink into smaller gatherings. Watching the gods who once felt like sovereigns become slowly guardians of memory. But Mesopotamia had one advantage in this new world. Remembers, its scholars, specifically its astronomers. This is the part that always makes me pause. Remembers, because it reveals a kind of cultural survival strategy that feels incredibly intelligent. Remembers, Babylonian astronomers maintained astronomical diaries with precise celestial observations. Remembers, preserving traditional associations between planetary movement and divine activity. Remembers, and their skill was so mathematically advanced that it didn't just survive Hellenistic rule, it commanded respect within Hellenistic intellectual circles. Remembers, think about what that means. While political legitimacy shifts away from temples, scientific authority becomes a new kind of sanctuary. Remembers, Babylonian mathematical astronomy, especially in the Seleucid period, culminates centuries of temple-based scholarship. Remembers, predictive models for planetary motion required computational techniques that were genuinely impressive, so impressive that they outperformed contemporary Greek methods in certain respects. Remembers, this scientific reputation allowed Babylonian scholars to keep their status even as the old temple-centered civic order weakened. Remembers, and here's the subtle but crucial point, their astronomy was spiritually neutral. The observations were scientific. Remembers, yes, but they were still embedded in a worldview where celestial phenomena were meaningful, where planets carried divine names. Remembers, where eclipses weren't just events, they were messages. That's why figures like the astronomer Kidinu matter. Remembers, he becomes an emblem of synthesis, rigorous computation paired with traditional interpretation. Remembers, predicting lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy while still framing those eclipses as signs of divisor or cosmic conflict. Remembers, it's a worldview that doesn't see contradiction between precision and myth, it sees them as two levels of the same reality. But this is where the transformation begins to take a darker, more ambiguous turn. Remembers, because when religious authority loses its political center, the divine does disappear, it relocates. Where the Anunnaki begin drifting from public rulers to private forces. The evidence shows up in places you might not expect, like the magical papyri of Egypt. Remembers, where Mesopotamian deity names appear as invoked powers, but the way they were used is different. Remembers, the Anunnaki in these texts are not cosmic sovereigns whose decisions shape kingship and weather. Remembers, they are powerful spirits available for individual ritual manipulation. That line is haunting. Remembers, from rulers of the city to agents you can call. It's like watching the divine get reclassified, not destroyed, repositioned. Remembers, it fits a broader Hellenistic cultural trend, the rise of personal horoscopic astrology. Remembers, Babylonian scholars adapt their planetary deity associations into individualized predictions based on birth dates and celestial configurations. The old cosmic theology becomes practical guidance for private decision-making. Fate, remembers, once decreed in a collective framework tied to the city and the king, becomes personalized. The question is no longer, what do the gods decree for the city this year? It becomes, what do the stars decree for me? Remembers, that is a profound shift in religious experience, and the more I think about it, remembers, the more it feels like an early version of something we recognize today, the move from public religion to private spirituality. Remembers, the move from communal ritual to individualized meaning, the move from we to me. In magical practice, this individualization becomes even more explicit. Marduk's authority over cosmic order makes him valuable for rites aimed at imposing control over chaos. Remembers, Enki's association with wisdom attracts those who want technical solutions. He becomes a patron of problem-solving in the supernatural register. Remembers, the divine attributes remain, but their function changes. They serve individual needs rather than civic order. Remembers at the same time something stubborn refuses to die: cuneiform literacy. Even as Aramaic and Greek dominate daily life, specialized scholarly communities keep copying and studying traditional texts. Remembers, the latest datable cuneiform tablets from Babylon into the 1st century CE include copies of classical Mudja compositions alongside astronomical and mathematical texts. Remembers that detail moves me more than I expected it would, because it's not just history, it's a picture of human persistence. Remembers, people sitting in quiet rooms, pressing reeds into clay, preserving stories that their broader society is slowly forgetting. Remembers, it's like a civilization keeping a heartbeat alive in a back chamber, and through those scholars, as Anunnaki concepts leak into the wider Mediterranean world indirectly. Remembers, Greek astronomical texts incorporate Babylonian computational methods and often preserve deity names for planets and stars. Remembers, so even when someone in the Greco-Roman world thinks they're redoing Greek astronomy, they sometimes using Mesopotamian bones under Greek skin. Remembers, then there's another channel that fascinates me because it shows how ideas survive by transforming. There's Jewish communities in Mesopotamia. After the Babylonian exile, Jewish thinkers develop complex relationships with local traditions. They reject polytheism, but they don't live in a cultural vacuum. Remembers, apocalyptic literature and texts like Daniel reflect knowledge of Babylonian rituals and divine hierarchies. Mesopotamian motifs, cosmic conflict, divine judgment get adapted into monotheistic frames, structures remain. Remembers, meanings shift, it's the same pattern again, preservation through reinterpretation. Remembers, and as the political map changes again when Parthian rule takes Mesopotamia during the 2nd century BC, traditional practices find a slightly more favorable climate. Remembers, Parthians tend to allow local autonomy if political loyalty is maintained. Remembers, archaeological evidence suggests renewed construction and ritual innovation in some temple sites, but it's not a full restoration. Remembers, the social world is already altered. The temples operate within limits they didn't have before. Remembers, out of that altered world emerge communities like the Mandaeans, preserving elements of Mesopotamian cosmology inside Gnostic frameworks focused on esoteric knowledge and spiritual salvation. Remembers, their texts hold echoes of older creation narratives, primordial waters, divine assemblies. Remembers, hierarchical beings governing cosmic functions yet reinterpreted through their own theological lens. Remembers, and then Zoroastrian influence adds another layer. Remembers, late Mesopotamian deities can be incorporated into Persian cosmic hierarchies as divine beings serving a larger monotheistic or dualistic order. Remembers, not erasure but reclassification. If I had to describe the Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic transformation in one emotional phrase, remembers, it would be, the gods moved from the streets into the margins, they lost the city as their stage but gained the Scalus tablet. Remembers, the astrologer's chart, the magician's incantation, the translator's manuscript, the mystic's cosmology. Remembers, and that leads to a paradox that keeps me thinking. Remembers, the decline of temple institutions didn't kill Anunnaki traditions, it freed them to travel. Remembers, once the ideas detach from a specific city-state's political needs, they become portable. Remembers, they can be carried through networks of scholars and translators, they can be embedded in scientific texts. From ritual manuals, esoteric communities, they can survive in fragments, sometimes barely recognizable. Remembers, but still live. That's why late antiquity becomes less a graveyard and more a network. Remembers, Syriac Christian communities in northern Mesopotamia, for example, become crucial preservers of astronomical and mathematical knowledge. Remembers, they translate Greek astronomical works, some of which already include Babylonian computational methods, and they sometimes still have bilingual scholars who can access the older cuneiform tradition. The Syriac translation of Ptolemy's Almagest, completed in the 6th century, remembers, helps preserve star catalogues and planetary theories where traditional names and associations can linger. Remembers, figures like Severus Sebot in the 7th century become symbols of continuity, intellectuals living long after the old temples have faded. Remembers, yet still discussing Babylonian methods for calculating planetary positions. He even famously compares numeral systems. Remembers, praising Indian numerals as superior, showing how these scholars weren't merely preserving, they were evaluating. Remember, synthesizing, moving knowledge forward. Meanwhile, Mandaean communities in the south maintain ritual community ceremonies like the Masikta, as guiding souls, preserving techniques of divine communication that echo ancient practices even as theology shifts. Remembers, then Islamic scholarly circles become another major channel. Remembers, Baghdad's translation movement in the 8th and 9th centuries brings together Greek, Persian, Sanskrit science alongside whatever Mesopotamian knowledge survived in local forms. Remembers, scholars like the Banu Musa brothers translate and preserve astronomical material where Babylonian star names and mythology still cast shadows. Remembers, or Batoni compiles star catalogues that blend Babylonian, Greek, and Arabic data into comprehensive works. Remembers, and then there's Harun the Sabians claiming ancient wisdom traditions and maintaining a distinctive planar theology under Islamic law. Remembers, through translators and court advisors like Thabit ibn Qurra, ancient computational methods continue to influence medieval science. Remembers, even medical knowledge, plant-based remedies, diagnostic techniques can trace ancestry through layers of translation and adaptation. Remembers, magical and astrological texts in the medieval period like the Yatul Akem Pikatrix or Abu Mashas were. Remember, preserve ritual procedures and planetary spirit invocations that echo older Mesopotamian patterns. Remembers, again, the theology is transformed, monotheistic constraints reshape everything, but the structural idea persists. Remembers, celestial powers influence earthly affairs and knowledge can negotiate that influence, and I want to pause. Remembers, because if you're listening closely, you can hear what I'm really saying. The Anunnaki didn't simply end. Remembers, they evolved into channels: science, astrology, ritual, translation, mysticism, which makes the modern recovery feel almost like a reunion. When European scholars in the 19th century began deciphering cuneiform Grotefend Rawlinson, was the Behistun inscription, they weren't just unlocking a dead script. Remembers, they were reopening a sealed archive of a worldview that had been compressed into fragments for over a millennium. Layard's discoveries at night. Remembers, the library of Ashurbanipal with tens of thousands of tablets. This is where the Anunnaki returned to the modern mind, not as rumors but as texts you can hold. Remembers, translate, argue over. George Smith's discovery of flood narratives electrifies the world. Remembers, because suddenly biblical stories have older cousins. Then excavations at Babylon, Nippur Mari. Eridu expand the archive, administrative records, hymns, myths. There was commentaries, the full spectrum of a civilization's sacred and practical mind, and modern scholars build a consensus. Remembers, the Anunnaki were not aliens, they were administrative deities, patrons of city-states. Remembers, theological expressions of how the first urban societies understood cosmic order and political legitimacy. Remembers, their myths encode real social concerns: labor, kingship, justice, survival wrapped in cosmic drama. Remembers, which brings us back to the emotional center of all this, at least for me. Remembers, the Hellenistic era didn't just threaten Anunnaki worship with conquest, it forced the system to confront a new question. Remembers, can a divine order survive when the structures that gave it public authority are replaced? And the answer, remembers, astonishingly, is yes, but at a cost. The cost is transformation. The cost is shrinking from public governance into private meaning. The cost is translation into other frameworks. The cost is becoming something you consult, study, or invoke rather than something that governs your city with unquestioned authority. But survival is still survival. Remembers, and as we move forward, the story gets even sharper, because once the Anunnaki are no longer anchored in temple power, remembers, they become available to be reimagined. Scholars reinterpret them, esoteric traditions reshape them. As popular culture eventually turns them into extraterrestrial myths, modern reconstructionist movements try to revive them. Remembers, the question stops being who were the Anunnaki to ancient Mesopotamia, and becomes what do we keep turning them into? Light. Remembers. And that's where our journey starts to feel less like archaeology and more like a mirror held up to every era that touches them, including ours. Remembers, and that question, what we keep turning the Anunnaki into, and why, leads us straight into the modern era, where the past doesn't just get recovered, it gets fought over. Remembers, because once the last temple economies had faded and the clay tablets stopped being copied as living documents, remembers, the Anunnaki didn't simply disappear, they went dormant, like a language no one speaks anymore, still etched into stone. Remembers, waiting for someone to remember how to read it. For centuries, Mesopotamia's sacred world became a carved room in human history, where we knew something enormous had once been inside, but the key was lost. Then, in the 1800s, the key reappeared, not in the form of a priest, or a prophet, or a king. Remembers, but in the hands of scholars with ink-stained fingers and a stubborn willingness to stare at strange wedge marks until they started to talk. Remembers, I want you to feel the weirdness of that moment. Imagine standing before an inscription you can see red lines of tiny angular impressions. Remembers, like bird tracks pressed into stone. For everyone around you, it's decoration, a pattern, a silent relic. But for one person, it's a code, and the instant that code begins to break open, remembers, an entire civilization re-enters the conversation of the living. That's what happens with Georg Friedrich Grotefend, 1802. Remembers, he's a German philologist, not an adventurer. No dramatic ruins collapsing behind him, just a mind trained in comparative patterns. Remembers, he looks at old Persian inscriptions and begins identifying recurring royal names and titles, essentially grabbing the first loose thread of cuneiform and pulling Remembers, it's the kind of breakthrough that looks small in the moment and becomes monumental in hindsight, because once you can read even a fraction, remembers, you can build a ladder, but the ladder still needs rungs, and this is where the story takes on that almost cinematic intensity. Remembers Henry Rawlinson suspended on rope copying the Behistun inscription carved high on a cliff in western Iran. Remembers, this isn't romantic myth-making, this is painstaking, risky physical labor in service of knowledge. Remembers the Behistun text is trilingual, which makes it a Rosetta Stone of the cuneiform world. Was Rawlinson's accurate copies and his 1851 publication give European scholars the parallel texts needed to establish grammar. Remembers vocabulary and eventually the ability to read Akkadian and Sumerian sources that were previously locked away. Remembers, when I think about it, what moves me isn't just the intellectual achievement, it's the human persistence behind it. Because this isn't curiosity as a hobby, this is curiosity as obsession, the kind of obsession that says, remembers, I'm going to make the dead speak again even if it takes my whole life. And once cuneiform starts to yield meaning, remembers, the floodgates open, the British Museum acquires what Austin Henry Layard excavates at Nineveh. Remembers, including the library of Ashurbanipal, tens of thousands of tablets and fragments. Remembers, and here's where you have to pause and really let the scale sink in, this isn't a handful of relics. Remember, it's an archive, a civilization's inner filing cabinet, myths, hymns, administrative records, medical texts. Remember, astronomical diaries, omen literature, lexicons, an entire intellectual ecosystem. For the first time, remembers, the Anunnaki aren't shadows in second-hand classical references. They renames in their own language. They reactive characters inside stories that the culture itself wrote for itself. Then comes George Smith in Keen 72. Remembers, reading through tablet fragments and realizing he's holding something that sounds shockingly familiar. A flood narrative. Remembers, his announcement creates an international sensation because it doesn't just add a new myth to the world, it arranges a foundation stone of Western religious imagination. Suddenly, the biblical flood has an older cousin, the public crowds his lecture, newspapers amplify it. Mesopotamia stops being mysterious ancient East and becomes a living contender in the history of ideas. Remembers, and as more flood accounts are identified, especially the Atrahasis tradition, the deeper logic of Mesopotamian theology begins to show itself. Remembers, divine judgment, cosmic governance, the tension between humanity's usefulness and humanity's threat. Remembers, these aren't nails, they are sophisticated narratives used to think through power, morality, and order. Excavations expand the archive even further. Robert Coldwaith's long work at Babylon reveals monumental architecture, Ishtar Gate. Remembers, processional ways, the foundations of great sacred structures, and also yields tablets from residential and commercial settings. Remembers, that detail matters because it proves something important. The gods weren't trapped inside temples as abstract ideology. Remembers, religious concepts penetrated daily life, people conducted commerce, signed contracts, navigated disputes. Remembers, lived ordinary lives in a world where divine administration was woven into everything. Remembers, Leonard Woolley's excavations at uncover the royal cemetery and evidence of how divine kingship and ritual power shaped society. Remembers, Nippur yields tens of thousands of tablets from Enlil's temple archives. Mary's letters reveal rulers consulting patron deities through prophetic channels like its routine policy. Eridu confirms temple continuity across staggering time depth levels stacked like sedimentary layers of devotion. And as these sites are excavated and these texts are translated, remembers, modern scholarship gradually clarifies something that cuts through centuries of fantasy. Remembers, the Anunnaki were not some vague mystical gods in the sky, in academic terms. Remembers, they functioned as administrative deities, patrons of city-states, anchors of political legitimacy, regulators of cosmic and civic order inside the earliest urban civilizations. Remembers, you can almost hear the modern scholarly voice tightening the focus. The Anunnaki were integrated into systems of kingship. Remembers, economics, law, and ritual, their temples were administrative centers managing agriculture, craft production. Remembers, labor organization, trade networks, their myths weren't random entertainment. Remembers, they were political theology, stories used to justify authority, explain suffering, define humanity's role. Remembers, argue about who gets to rule. When I read this scholarship, remembers, what strikes me is how much it changes the emotional texture of the Anunnaki. They stop being exotic and start being familiar. Remembers, not familiar in the sense of the same gods, but familiar in their function. Remembers, a civilization trying to create meaning in the face of uncertainty, using divine narrative to organize reality. Remembers, but here's the twist, because the moment academic clarity starts building, something else begins to rise in parallel. Remembers, a different Anunnaki, one that belongs less to Assyriology and more to modern longing. This is where the story becomes tense. because two narratives start competing, one grounded in philology, archaeology, and context. Remembers another fueled by the appetite for cosmic secrets, and I get it, I really do, because the real Mesopotamians is complex. Remembers it's slow, it requires patience, nuance, and the humility to accept that the past doesn't exist to entertain us. Remembers, but the alternative story, the one that turns the Anunnaki into extraterrestrials, offers a rush. Remembers, it offers a clean answer to a messy question. How did civilization develop so fast? It offers a myth that feels modern. Space travel, genetic engineering, lost technology, hidden history. Zecharia Sitchin becomes the major figure here. For the 12th Planet, 1976. Remembers, he claims that Sumerian and Akkadian texts contain literal evidence for a planet called Nibiru and its inhabitants, the Anunnaki, arriving on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago to mine gold. Remembers, then genetically modifying hominids to create humans as a labor force. It's a narrative built to feel like revelation. Remembers, it frames ancient gods as misunderstood astronauts. It turns myth into disguised reportage. Remembers, then the ancient astronaut hypothesis broadens through authors like Erich von Däniken. Remembers, who argues that various monuments and artifacts worldwide indicate extraterrestrial visitation. The method is seductive. Remembers, point to something impressive, highlight what feels unexplained, and offer alien intervention as the missing piece. Remembers, it's a kind of intellectual shortcut disguised as daring imagination, and then television perfects it. Remembers, you can feel the cultural temperature shift when a show like Ancient Aliens takes over the visual imagination, dramatic reenactments. Remembers, computer-generated imagery, ominous music, the constant suggestion that mainstream scholars are ignoring obvious clues. Remembers, it's entertainment, but it carries itself like investigation. And that's where it gets dangerous. Remember, because the format creates a false balance. It places careful scholarship beside speculation and implies both equally plausible. Remembers, here's what hurts me about that, because I'm not against wonder, I'm not against mystery, I'm not even against imaginative storytelling. Remembers, but I'm against the quiet disrespect that comes from treating ancient people as if they couldn't build. Remembers, couldn't think, couldn't organize their world without help from beings in spacecraft? It's a strange kind of arrogance. Remembers, the modern mind projecting its own technologies backward and assuming that anything impressive must have been assisted. The academic response has been consistent. The linguistic foundation of Sitchin's claims doesn't hold up. Remembers, specialists point out errors in readings and translations. Archaeologically, there's no trace of the advanced technologies such a narrative would require. And historically, remembers, Mesopotamian civilization shows gradual development through successive phases: agriculture, craft specialization, urbanization, rather than a sudden alien jumpstart. The more you understand early Uruk-Ubaid context, incremental changes in settlement patterns and production, the more the alien narrative looks like a refusal to accept human complexity. But here's the uncomfortable truth: the alternative narrative thrives anyway. Why? Remembers, it satisfies emotional needs academic writing doesn't. It turns the human story into a cosmic drama. Remembers, it makes the universe feel crowded with intention. It gives people a sense that they are part of something immense. Remembers, engineered, watched, designed, and it offers an intoxicating sense of being in on the secret, which is a powerful psychological law. Remembers, and while this speculative stream grows, another modern stream appears, quiet, serious, and oddly moving in its own way. Reconstructionist and neo-pagan movements that attempt to revive Mesopotamian religious practice. Remembers, this is one of those developments I didn't expect to find compelling until I sat with it, because on paper it sounds niche. Remembers, almost eccentric, modern groups learning cuneiform, studying ritual texts, reconstructing liturgies. Remembers, creating ceremonies for gods who haven't been publicly worshipped for nearly 2 millennia. But if you listen closely, remembers, it's not just reenactment, it's longing. It's people trying to reconnect with something ancient and structured. Remember, something that feels older than the modern spiritual marketplace. And these movements face profound challenges. Remembers, the sources are incomplete. Rituals were designed for large temple communities, and there's no unbroken line of transmission. Remembers, so modern practitioners must rely on scholarship, ironically making academia not just an observer but an ingredient. Remember, some groups prioritize historical accuracy even when it's impractical. Others adapt freely. Remembers, mixing Mesopotamian inspiration with modern spiritual needs. Remembers, what fascinates me is how these communities reveal a complex relationship between history and meaning. Remembers, even when they are imperfect reconstructions, they demonstrate that ancient deities still have symbolic power. Remembers, they still speak, if not as literal cosmic administrators, then as frameworks for thinking about order. Remembers, fate's responsibility and the human place in a vast system. Remembers, and then there's popular culture, the broad river that carries the Anunnaki into the modern imagination regardless of scholarship or religion. Novels weave Mesopotamian gods into narratives about cultural change. Video games place players inside ancient worlds, blending history with fantasy. Films and series borrow names and motifs because they sound ancient. Remembers, powerful and mysterious. In this realm, accuracy is secondary, resonance is everything. Remembers, which brings me to the piece of this I can't stop thinking about, the digital age. Remembers, projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and other open corpora have democratized access to primary sources. Remembers, thousands of tablets, transliterations, translations, images suddenly available to anyone with an internet connection. This is, in many ways, a miracle. It breaks the monopoly of elite institutions and invites global curiosity. But it creates a new problem. When everyone can access sources, not everyone has the tools to interpret them responsibly. Remembers, so the digital world becomes a kind of echo chamber battleground where scholarship and pseudoscience spread side by side. Remembers, accurate translations appear next to wildly imaginative reinterpretations, and the average person curious. Remembers, hungry for meaning, maybe skeptical of authority, has to navigate it in that sense. The modern Anunnaki story isn't just about ancient Mesopotamia, it's about our era's crisis of trust. Remembers, expertise and narrative, and if I'm honest, I don't think the question "who were the Anunnaki" is the most revealing question anymore. Remembers, the more revealing question is, what does each modern version of the Anunnaki say about us? Academic scholarship says we want grounded understanding even if it's complex and slow. Alternative theories say we crave cosmic drama and hidden truths. Remembers, and we sometimes willing to sacrifice rigor for wonder. Reconstructionist practice says we long for roots. Remembers, ritual and continuity. Popular culture says we hunger for symbols that can carry big themes: creation, power, judgment, destiny into new stories. Remembers, so when I look at the Anunnaki's journey from the administrative gods of the world's first cities to the contested icons of modern imagination, I don't just see an ancient religion. Remembers, I see humanity repeating a cycle. We recover the past, we interpret it, we fight over it. Remembers, we remake it into what we need, and that's why the Anunnaki feel strangely alive in modern discourse. Remembers, not because they returned as gods in the old sense, but because the questions they once organized: cosmic order, remembers, authority, moral responsibility, human purpose, never stopped haunting us. And if that's true, remembers, then what we do next matters, because the final phase of this story isn't just about tablets and theories. Remembers, it's about the tension between evidence and desire, between history and myth-making. Remembers, between the discipline of knowledge and the seduction of narrative. And that tension is exactly where the last part of our journey is headed. Remembers, with that uneasy modern mirror still shimmering in front of us. Remembers, we were finally ready to walk back into the oldest kind of darkness, the one where a dead civilization speaks again. Remembers, not through myth but through recovered voices pressed into clay. Remembers, always imagine the first moment like a crime scene you didn't know you were standing inside. Remembers, a traveler in the early 1800s looks at an ancient stone covered in wedge-shaped scratches, marks that seem decorative. Remembers, meaningless, almost stubbornly silent, and then somewhere between obsession and intuition, a scholar decides marks are art. Remembers, they relanguage, they re-locked door, and the world has simply forgotten where the key goes. Remembers, that's the emotional hinge of this whole saga for me, because everything we've talked about, Hellenistic syncretism, temple decline, the shifting identity of the gods. Remembers, the survival of ideas through astronomy and translation depends on whether those clay voices can be heard again. Remembers, without decipherment the Anunnaki remain a fog of second-hand references. With decipherment they become a library. That Georg Friedrich Grotefend is where I feel the story truly turns. When he wasn't standing inside a grand university system with unlimited resources and a roadmap. He was staring at copies of inscriptions and trying to do something audacious. Treat repetition as a clue. Remembers, treat pattern as a doorway. By identifying royal names and titles in old Persian inscriptions. Remembers, he proved something that sounds simple now but was revolutionary then: these wedges could be read. The past was not permanently lost. Remembers, it was encrypted. And once that idea exists, it spreads like fire through dry grass, because if one corner of the script can be unlocked, remembers, then the rest might follow. Henry Rawlinson took that possibility and risked his body for it. I can get the image out of my head. Remember, suspended on ropes, copying the massive trilingual Behistun inscription carved into a cliff, not metaphorically hanging on every word. Literally hanging. Remembers, it's hard to explain to a modern mind, one trained to think knowledge should be easy to access, what that level of devotion means. Remembers, but it tells you something important. Scholarship at its best is not cold, it's passionate. It's faith-like, but directed toward evidence. Remembers, when Rawlinson's work gave scholars parallel texts to compare Old Persian beside Akkadian and Elamite, it wasn't just a linguistic breakthrough. It was a time machine. Remembers, it gave Europe the first real chance to build grammar rules and vocabulary lists for languages no one alive had spoken in thousands of years. Remembers, that's not just academic, that's eerie, that's like resurrecting a voice that hasn't breathed since before Rome existed. Remembers, and then came the tablets, the physical weight of them, the sheer scale. Remembers, when Austin Henry Layard excavated Nineveh and uncovered a Shorbanipal's library, tens of thousands of tablets, it was like stumbling onto the fossil record of thought. Remembers, people love to talk about lost wisdom, but this was literal catalogued wisdom, organized by subject. Remembers, cross-reference, curated by an empire that understood knowledge as power. And suddenly the Anunnaki were no longer a rumor. They were names on clay, hymns, myths, administrative lists, omens, ritual instructions. The boring and the sacred side by side, the way real civilizations actually live. Remember George Smith's discovery in 1872 that a flood narrative existed in these tablets hit the world like thunder. Remembers, and I understand why. Flood stories don't just fascinate us, they haunt us, they tap into something primal. Remembers, the fear that everything we build can be washed away overnight. But for scholarship, the shock wasn't only emotion, it was methodological. It was a direct bridge between Mesopotamian mythic literature and later religious traditions. Remembers, not because one copied the other in some cheap way, but because ideas travel, mutate, and echo. Remembers, Smith's work forced the public to confront a simple truth. The ancient Near East wasn't a footnote. Remembers, foundational. From there, the story becomes a widening circle of excavation and interpretation. Robert Calderwace's long dig at Babylon wasn't just about spectacular architecture like the Ishtar Gate or the foundations of great temples. Remembers, it was about context, about proving that these myths weren't floating in the air, they were anchored in real streets. Remembers, real processional ways, real economic systems that fed the machinery of worship. When the Enuma Elish was recovered, remembers, it wasn't simply a cool creation story. It was a theological argument dressed as epic poetry, a narrative built to justify political reality. Remembers, to explain why Marduk stands above the others, why Babylon can claim cosmic centrality. Remembers, and that's where the Anunnaki become more human to me, not because they were just made up, but because the act of making meaning is human. Mesopotamian theology is often described as if it's only superstition. Remembers, but when you read these texts as the intellectual products of a society wrestling with order, cosmic order, remembers, political order, moral order, you realize how disciplined the thinking is. Myth in Mesopotamia is not lazy. Remembers, it's structured, it's strategic, so worldview under pressure. Then you get Leonard Woolley, a royal tomes. Remembers, lavish burial goods, evidence of human sacrifice, and suddenly the relationship between kingship and divinity becomes visceral. This wasn't abstract belief, it shaped bodies, it shaped death rituals, it shaped who lived, who died. Remembers, and how power justified itself. And at Nippur, with the discovery of tens of thousands of tablets from the Imbil temple complex. Remembers, the scale of religious administration becomes undeniable. Temples weren't just places of prayer, they were engines. Storing grain, assigning labor, financing trade, recording debts. Remembers, the Anunnaki weren't floating gods above society, they were embedded in the paperwork of civilization. Remember, and then there's the part that feels almost poetic in its irony. Even as ancient temples declined in late antiquity, modern institutions, museums, universities, archaeological expeditions became the new temples that preserved and reassembled the tradition. Remembers, scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, translating Sumerian hymns and myths, weren't just doing language work. Remembers, they were reconstructing a conceptual universe. Every deciphered sign didn't just yield a word, it yielded a way of thinking. Remembers, this is why I've never been able to accept the idea that the Anunnaki story ends when temple worship collapses. Remembers, it doesn't end, it changes containers, it moves into libraries, into catalogues, into dictionaries. Remembers, into the painstaking labor of philology and archaeology. It becomes something we can argue over with footnotes instead of incense. And that brings us to the modern consensus that sits like a quiet anchor amid the noise. Academically, the Anunnaki are understood as central figures in the earliest urban religious systems, divine authorities tied to cosmic order. Remembers, political legitimacy and city-state identity, their myths weren't primitive fantasies. Remembers, they were complex narratives that integrated practical concerns, labor, agriculture, kingship, justice with metical structures, creation. Remembers, fate, divine assembly, moral consequence. But here's what I keep coming back to and what I want to leave you with. Remembers, the recovery of these texts didn't just give us information, it gave us humility. Remembers, because once you realize how much effort it takes to retrieve a single line from the ancient world, how many accidents. Remembers, obsessions, risks, and lifetimes of study stand behind one translated tablet. You start to respect the past differently. As you stop treating it like a prop for modern arguments, you stop turning it into a stage for easy certainty. Remembers, and you also start to feel the fragility of it all. So much is still broken, so much is still missing. Remembers, for every tablet we can read, there are fragments we can T-place, lines we can T-reconstruct, contexts we'll never fully recover. Remembers, the Anunnaki we know are already filtered through survival, through chance, through what was copied and what was discarded. Remembers, through what was buried and what was looted, through what museums hold and what remains lost. Remembers, which means our relationship to this ancient tradition can only be one thing, if we were being honest. Remembers, a relationship built on curiosity, reverence, and restraint, because the most astonishing part isn't that the Anunnaki were once worshipped. Remembers, it's that after thousands of years of silence, they can still speak if we were patient enough to listen. Remembers, what stays with me after walking through all of this isn't just a list of gods' dates or ruined temples, it's the pattern. The Anunnaki begin as a way to explain why the world feels ordered, why power claims legitimacy, why societies need rules that feel bigger than any one person. Then empires arrive, languages shift. Remembers, and the old rituals shrink, yet the ideas don't vanish, they migrate, they hide inside astronomy, law. Remembers, literature, magic, and later inside archaeology and modern debates about what really happened. And that's the unsettling part. The story isn't only about Mesopotamia. Remembers, it's about how human beings keep rebuilding meaning whenever the world changes faster than our certainties can keep up. Remember, here's the deeper lesson I take from it. Remembers, every era creates its own Anunnaki, its own invisible authority that explains reality and justifies decisions. Remembers, in ancient cities, it was the divine assembly that decreed fate. Today it might be the algorithm, the market, public opinion, the ideology of your group, even the voice in your own head that says this is how life works. Remembers, the danger isn't believing in something larger than yourself. The danger is letting any system, religious, remembers, political, technological, or personal, make your choices for you without scrutiny. So how do you apply that in real life? Remembers, start by identifying the assembly influencing your decisions. When you're stressed, when you're chasing status. Remembers, when you're afraid of missing out, ask a simple question. Who is decreeing my fate right now? Is it my long-term values? Remembers, or is it panic? Is it evidence, or is it the crowd? Then practice a second step. Rebuild your foundation consciously. Remembers, use the best tools of the modern world: critical thinking, good sources, patience. Remembers, and self-honesty to separate what's true from what's merely compelling. The goal isn't to become cynical. Remembers, it's to become free, able to respect tradition, appreciate mystery, and still demand real standards before you give your belief away. Remembers, now I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest invisible authority shaping people's lives today? Remembers, technology, money, politics, or social pressure? Please comment your answer down below so we can all compare perspectives. And if you want more deep story-driven history like this, remembers, subscribe to Empire's Historical. It genuinely helps the channel grow and gives us the fuel to make the next even stronger.